This morning, 20 days into the search for Nancy Guthrie, there have been setbacks and challenges and still no suspect. But some 400 FBI agents and sheriff deputies are still actively working the case, canvassing the city as they try to find answers to so many of the unknowns.
Part of what makes this search so challenging is just how vast the area around Nancy's home is. You can get a sense of it here. Pima County is about 9,000 square miles. That is larger than the entire state of New Jersey. And a lot of it looks like this: massive mountain ranges and the Sonoran Desert that stretches for miles.
But the Pima County Sheriff says the case is far from cold. They're still analyzing unknown DNA found at Nancy's home and other leads, including the suspect's backpack, gun, and what the sheriff has described as his unique-looking holster. Firearms expert John Correa says it appears to be a universal fit holster and isn't one an experienced gun owner would use.
This does not strike me as a highly trained professional. This guy's an amateur.
The search for Nancy also expanding. A missing persons group in Mexico sharing this flyer about her disappearance, although the sheriff maintains there's no evidence to suggest she was taken across the border. And many across Tucson are refusing to give up hope.
Whenever we go out, we say, okay, look for any clues or anything different as we go along that you wouldn't normally see.
Inside the county's 911 communication center, dispatchers inundated with tips. Some 50,000 tips have come in between the sheriff's department and FBI combined.
What do you think it says that you're getting so many tips about this case?
I think it says that people care.
The night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, nothing about the scene felt random. An 84-year-old woman was at home in the quiet Catalina foothills outside Tucson, Arizona. She had spent the evening with family. She had been driven home by her son-in-law. Her garage door opened just before 9:50 p.m., then closed. By every normal expectation, that should have been the end of the story for the night. A peaceful return home, a locked door, sleep, morning. But morning came, and Nancy Guthrie was gone. She did not show up for the church live stream she was expected to watch with friends. Her family grew worried. When relatives went to check on her home, they found her personal belongings still inside. Her phone was there. Essential items were still there. And for a woman with limited mobility, there was no clear sign that she had simply stepped out on her own. Then came the details that changed everything. Investigators would later reveal that during the early morning hours, Nancy's doorbell camera captured a masked figure approaching the house. The person appeared armed. At one point, the figure seemed to interact directly with the camera before it went offline. Not long after, data from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker app showed it had disconnected from her phone. On the front porch, investigators found blood later confirmed to be hers. This was no longer a missing person case wrapped in uncertainty. It was something darker, more deliberate, more terrifying. And then, just as fear was taking hold, the case took another disturbing turn. Purported ransom notes began surfacing. Millions of dollars were demanded. Deadlines were set. Public pleas followed. Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces in American television, stepped out of her usual role and into a nightmare no family ever wants to live through. With her siblings at her side, she begged for her mother's return, while investigators tried to untangle a trail of surveillance footage, DNA evidence, tips, false leads, and a suspect who seemed to vanish as quickly as he appeared. More than 2 months later, the mystery had only deepened. No arrest, no confirmed motive, no answers. Only a growing question hanging over Tucson, over the Guthrie family, and over everyone watching the case unfold. Who took Nancy Guthrie from her home in the middle of the night, and why? We will now go back to the final known hours before Nancy vanished, the moment concern turned into alarm, and the chilling evidence that convinced investigators from the very beginning that this was no ordinary disappearance. Before we continue, like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you think this was a targeted abduction, or did the truth begin much closer to home? On Saturday, January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie spent the evening doing something completely ordinary. She was with family. For a case that would soon command national attention, the final confirmed hours of Nancy's known movements began with a scene that felt warm, routine, and unremarkable. She went to her daughter Annie's home near Tucson, where the family shared dinner and game night together. There was nothing in those hours, at least from what has been reported publicly, to suggest that anyone present knew they were witnessing the last normal evening before everything changed. Nancy was 84 years old. By all accounts, she had limits that come with age, including mobility issues, but there was no indication she had simply disappeared by choice. That fact would become crucial very quickly, because when investigators later looked at the evidence, one thing stood out almost immediately. This did not appear to be the kind of case where an elderly woman wandered off unnoticed into the night. Around 5:32 p.m., Nancy traveled to Annie's home. Hours later, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, drove her back to her residence in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, affluent area just outside Tucson. According to investigators, the garage door at Nancy's house opened at approximately 9:48 p.m. and closed around 9:50 p.m. Sheriff Chris Nanos would later say that this was the point at which investigators assumed Nancy was safely home and likely getting ready for bed. That detail matters because it helps establish the narrow window in which something went terribly wrong. At that point in the night, the story should have ended with silence. An elderly woman returns home after family time, settles in, and prepares for the next day. Nothing about that sequence suggests danger. Nothing suggests violence. Nothing suggests that by sunrise, investigators would be standing outside that same house trying to piece together signs of an apparent abduction. The next morning, Nancy did not appear where she was expected to be. She was known to spend Sundays watching a virtual church service with friends at a nearby home. When she failed to arrive, a concern began to build. It was not one of those situations where someone was assumed to be busy or where family waited days before reacting. The alarm rose quickly because Nancy was dependable, because she had an expected routine, and because her absence immediately felt wrong to those who knew her. A member of her church contacted the family after Nancy failed to appear as expected. That call set the next part of the timeline in motion. Relatives went to Nancy's home at around 11 a.m. on Sunday, February 1st, to check on her. They searched the house and the surrounding property. What they found was not a clear explanation. It was the opposite. Nancy was not there, but her personal belongings were. Her phone remained inside the home. Other essential items were still there, too. For investigators, this detail would carry enormous weight. It suggested Nancy had not calmly prepared to leave. It suggested she had not gone far intentionally. And because of her limited mobility, the idea that she had simply walked away became even harder to accept. At approximately 12:03 p.m., the family called 911 and reported Nancy missing. Deputies with the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived at the home soon after. By then, what began as concern had become something much more serious. Responding investigators saw enough to believe very early on that this was not a routine missing person report. That is one of the most striking parts of the Nancy Guthrie case. In many disappearances, families and investigators spend valuable time trying to determine whether the missing person left voluntarily, became disoriented, had a medical emergency, or simply broke routine. But here, based on the available evidence and the circumstances inside and around the home, law enforcement quickly leaned towards something more sinister. Then came the evidence that seemed to confirm those fears. Investigators would later say Nancy's front door camera was disconnected at 1:47 a.m. Hours before her disappearance was discovered, something had happened at the home during the darkest part of the night. Roughly 25 minutes later, surveillance software detected movement. And at 2:28 a.m., data from Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker app showed the device had disconnected from her phone. On their own, each of those details is unsettling. Together, they begin to form a chilling sequence. First, the camera goes down, then movement is detected, then the pacemaker connection is interrupted. If those events are connected the way investigators appear to believe they may be, then the timeline suggests Nancy's disappearance was already underway while most of Tucson was asleep. And that was only part of it. Authorities later revealed that blood found on Nancy's front porch was confirmed to be hers. That discovery transformed the emotional temperature of the case. It is one thing for a family to fear that a loved one is missing. It is another for law enforcement to confirm physical evidence at the home pointing to harm or force. From that moment on, the case no longer looked like an unexplained absence. It looked like Nancy Guthrie had been taken against her will. The house itself became central evidence. Investigators treated the scene with the seriousness of a suspected violent crime. Nancy's belongings remained inside. There was no public indication she had packed or prepared to leave. There was no known proof that she had stepped outside voluntarily and vanished down the road. Instead, the evidence pointed inward, toward the home, toward the overnight hours, and toward someone who may have approached her property with planning and purpose. Then the case grew even more disturbing. Doorbell camera footage showed a masked person outside Nancy's home shortly before she disappeared. Investigators said the person appeared to be armed. At one point, the individual seemed to directly interact with the camera, possibly trying to disable or obstruct it. The image was deeply unsettling because it made the threat real. This was not an abstract possibility or a vague theory. A person had been captured at the scene in the key window surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Authorities later described the suspect as likely male, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches, with an average build. They also identified the backpack seen in the footage as a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack. Those details gave the public something concrete to look for, but they also raised even more questions. Was the masked person the abductor? Was he acting alone? Had Nancy been specifically targeted? Or had this person been watching the house before that night? That last question became more significant as the case developed, because later reporting suggested the person seen in some of the released images may have been captured at Nancy's door on more than one date. If true, that would suggest surveillance, patience, familiarity, the kind of behavior that makes a case feel less impulsive and more calculated. And that possibility changes the emotional force of the story. Because if someone had been watching Nancy's home in advance, then this was not a random moment of opportunity. It may have been a planned approach to an elderly woman living alone, someone whose routine could be observed, someone whose vulnerabilities could be studied, someone whose family connection made her especially visible. But even at this early stage, investigators did not have the public answers needed to explain the motive. What they did have was a frightening pattern: a safe night with family, a return home just before 10 p.m., unexplained overnight activity, a disabled camera, movement at the property, the pacemaker disconnect, blood on the porch, and an elderly woman gone without her phone, medication, or basic belongings. That combination is what made the first chapter of this case so gripping and so painful. It did not begin with chaos out in public. It began in the place where Nancy should have been safest, her own home. For the Guthrie family, the fear must have escalated by the hour. At first, there was concern, then confusion, then dread. By the time law enforcement had processed the scene and the first facts began to emerge, the family was confronting a possibility no one wants to name out loud. Nancy had not just disappeared, she may have been taken. And if that was true, then the next question became even more urgent. Who knew enough about Nancy Guthrie's life, routine, home, or vulnerabilities to approach that property in the middle of the night and leave almost nothing behind except fear? In the continuation of this story, the mystery deepens as purported ransom notes begin to surface, public pressure explodes, and Nancy's children step into the spotlight with emotional pleas that turn a private family nightmare into a case the entire country is suddenly watching. If this case pulls you in, like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, do you think the masked figure came to that house for ransom for a personal reason or for something investigators still haven't uncovered? What happened next turned the Nancy Guthrie case from a terrifying disappearance into a national spectacle filled with desperation, conflicting signals, and a level of emotional pressure that few families could endure in public. In the first days after Nancy vanished, investigators were still trying to understand the scene, trace the overnight timeline, and determine whether the masked person seen on the doorbell footage was the key to everything. But before law enforcement could publicly answer the most basic questions, another shocking element entered the case: purported ransom messages. On February 3rd, several media outlets began receiving letters or messages from someone claiming to be connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. These communications reportedly demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin in exchange for her return. One included deadlines, one set for February 5th, another for February 9th. The notes did not just intensify the fear surrounding the case. They changed the psychological environment entirely. Now the family was not simply dealing with the possibility of abduction, they were dealing with the possibility that someone out there was watching the media response, using publicity as leverage, and possibly trying to force the family into a frantic race against time. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. The messages were not reported as having been sent directly and clearly to the family in a controlled law enforcement channel. Instead, they were reportedly sent to media organizations. That made the situation even harder to interpret. Were these genuine communications from an abductor? Were they opportunistic hoaxes designed to exploit a high-profile case? Were there real clues mixed in with deliberate confusion? At that stage, no one outside the investigation seemed to know for certain, and that uncertainty drove the family into an impossible position. On February 4th, Nancy's children went public in an emotional video appeal. Savannah Guthrie stood alongside her siblings, Annie and Cameron, asking for proof that their mother was alive and begging for direct contact. There is something uniquely painful about those early family videos. They are not polished performances. They are not press conferences built around certainty. They are the raw efforts of children trying to reach someone they cannot see, cannot identify, and cannot reason with in any normal way. In one of those first appeals, the message was direct. If someone had Nancy, the family was ready to listen. They needed to know she was alive. They needed a path forward. On that plea carried the tension that would define the next phase of the case, a family trying to remain hopeful while confronting evidence that suggested violence had already entered the story. On February 5th, as the first reported ransom deadline passed, Cameron Guthrie issued another appeal. He said the family had not heard anything directly and needed whoever had their mother to communicate. That line matters because it reveals just how unstable the ransom angle was becoming. Publicly, there were demands. Publicly, there were deadlines. But the kind of communication that might allow investigators to test authenticity and negotiate something concrete still appeared uncertain. That same day, the FBI announced a reward for information related to Nancy's recovery and to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. The Bureau's formal presence signaled what was already obvious. This was now a major federal investigation, not just a local missing person case. Then, 2 days later, the emotional pressure rose even higher. On February 7th, exactly 1 week after Nancy's disappearance, Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released another video message, and this time the words were haunting in their simplicity. "We will pay." Those 3 words carried enormous weight. They sounded like desperation, but they were also strategy. If the abduction had truly been motivated by money, the family was signaling willingness to comply. The message was designed to keep Nancy alive, to open a path of communication, to buy time if time was still possible. For viewers following the case, it was one of the moments that made the ordeal feel painfully real. This was no longer just law enforcement talking about suspects, evidence, and leads. This was a family speaking directly into the void, hoping the right person was listening. But even that did not bring clarity. By February 8th and 9th, more details about the purported ransom notes were circulating, including a reported demand for $6 million and a threat against Nancy's life if deadlines were missed. Yet still, there was no public proof of life, no publicly confirmed exchange that established where Nancy was, no visible breakthrough. Only the growing fear that the family might be responding to someone whose intentions were either far worse than ransom or entirely different. That is why this phase of the case became so psychologically complicated. The ransom angle suggested a financial motive, but the rest of the evidence did not settle neatly into that theory. Investigators believed Nancy had been taken from her home against her will. A masked suspect had tampered with the doorbell camera, Blood from Nancy was found on the porch, and yet instead of a clean pattern of extortion, the case was clouded by notes to media, shifting deadlines, and no obvious route to resolution. Then the visual evidence entered the story in a way that made the public obsession explode. On February 10th, the FBI released images and video from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera showing a masked individual at the front door. The person appeared armed. The footage seemed to show the suspect tampering with the camera. For the public, the release of that imagery was the moment the case became unforgettable. Until then, much of the story had been told through timeline, family statements, and investigative summaries. But once people could actually see the figure outside Nancy's home, the fear became concrete. Someone had been there, not in theory, not as a shadowy rumor, not as a vague possibility. A person was captured at the door of an 84-year-old woman's home in the middle of the night, and shortly afterward, she was gone. Savannah Guthrie quickly shared the images herself, urging the public to help identify the person. She wrote that someone out there would recognize him. That appeal was powerful because it tapped into one of the central hopes in cases like this, that no matter how carefully someone disguises themselves, they almost always leave behind something familiar. A posture, a body shape, a walk, clothing, gear, a routine purchase, a habit, and a vehicle nearby, a person watching from too close for too long. The release of the footage triggered a wave of public attention and, reportedly, thousands upon thousands of tips. Investigators canvassed surveillance footage from homes, businesses, and public locations across the Tucson area. They requested neighborhood video not just from the morning Nancy disappeared, but from a broader time span, suggesting they were trying to determine whether the suspect had been near the property on earlier dates. That thread would grow more important later, when reporting emerged that some of the suspect imagery may have come from more than one date. In other words, the masked person may not have appeared only on the morning Nancy disappeared. One image, the one reportedly showing the individual without a backpack or gun, was said by some sources to possibly come from an earlier visit. If that interpretation is correct, it raises the terrifying possibility that Nancy's home had been surveilled in advance. Still, even that possibility did not unlock the motive. By mid-February, the investigation was pulling in multiple directions at once. Authorities were processing evidence, examining possible DNA leads, reviewing massive quantities of video, and chasing tips that led as far as Rio Rico near the U.S.-Mexico border. On February 10th, a person was detained after a traffic stop there and later released. A search warrant was executed at a home in Rio Rico. For a brief moment, it may have seemed that investigators were closing in on something meaningful. But that moment passed without an arrest. Then came the glove. Authorities said gloves found near Nancy Guthrie's home appeared similar to those worn by the suspect in the footage. Because one glove contained DNA, it briefly looked like a possible forensic turning point. But the optimism around that evidence faded. First, officials said the DNA did not match anything in CODIS, the National DNA Database. Then they said it did not match DNA found at Nancy's home. Later, the glove DNA was traced to a local restaurant worker who was not considered part of the investigation. What had once looked like a key clue became another dead end. And dead ends in a case like this do more than slow an investigation. They intensify dread, because every false lead returns everyone to the same place. Nancy is still gone. The suspect is still unidentified, and the public knows just enough to be afraid, but not enough to understand. Meanwhile, the family was living through all of this in public view. On February 24th, Savannah Guthrie released perhaps one of the most painful public statements of the entire case. She said her mother may already be gone. Even as the family continued to hold on to hope, she acknowledged the possibility they were facing. But she also made something else clear. Even if Nancy had died, the family needed to know where she was. They needed answers. They needed truth. That moment marked a shift in tone. The family was no longer speaking only in the language of rescue. They were also speaking in the language of unbearable uncertainty. At the same time, the Guthries announced a personal reward of up to $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery, on top of the FBI reward already in place. Savannah also said the family would donate $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, reflecting an awareness that they were not the only family trapped in this kind of agony. That choice added emotional depth to the case because it showed the family trying to turn public attention into something larger than their own suffering. By late February, investigators were still reviewing thousands of hours of video, still examining physical evidence, still running down leads, and still offering no public explanation that could tie the facts together. Not ransom, not personal grievance, not targeted celebrity-adjacent extortion, not random violence. Nothing had yet emerged publicly as the clear answer. And that is what made chapter of this case so gripping and so haunting. The public had a masked suspect. The family had ransom-style messages. Law enforcement had blood, video, and an apparent overnight abduction. The media had deadlines, clues, contradictions, and constant speculation. But none of it had produced the one thing everyone needed most: Nancy Guthrie herself. By then, the case had become more than a disappearance. It had become a national mystery built on fear, visibility, and silence. By the time the Nancy Guthrie investigation moved deeper into its second month, the case had entered a frustrating and unsettling phase familiar to many major abduction cases. The public had seen enough evidence to know something terrible had happened, but not enough to understand how close investigators really were to the truth. This was the point where the case began to depend less on dramatic public developments and more on something far quieter, slower, and in some ways even more nerve-wracking: forensic analysis. Because once the early searches, public appeals, and urgent tip collection had run their course, the hope for a breakthrough increasingly shifted to the evidence left behind at Nancy Guthrie's home. And that evidence, from what has been publicly reported, was complicated. Investigators said DNA recovered from Nancy's house did not yield an easy answer. Some samples reportedly failed to produce a match in CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Others were described as mixed, meaning they contained genetic material from more than one person. In a case like this, that matters enormously. A mixed sample can be one of the most difficult forms of forensic evidence to interpret, especially in a lived-in environment where legitimate DNA from multiple people may already exist. A family home is not an empty laboratory. It is a place where relatives visit, surfaces are touched, hairs are shed, objects are moved, and innocent DNA can accumulate over time. So even if investigators believed they had something potentially significant, isolating what actually mattered could be painstaking. That helps explain why the forensic side of the case seemed to move with such agonizing slowness. Publicly, it may have looked like there were few major developments, but behind the scenes, samples were being processed, compared, reevaluated, and in some cases sent to multiple labs. Sheriff Chris Nano said several laboratories around the country were involved in working aspects of the Guthrie case. That detail alone suggests investigators believed the evidence was important enough and difficult enough to require specialized handling beyond a single local pipeline. One of the most significant reported developments involved hair recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. More than 2 months after Nancy vanished, reports emerged that the FBI had received and was actively analyzing a hair sample collected back in February. According to those reports, the sample had first gone through a private Florida lab used by the Pima County Sheriff's Department before being transferred to the FBI for advanced testing. The FBI later emphasized that this was not newly discovered evidence, but rather previously collected material that was now being examined with additional tools. That detail is important because it cuts both ways. On one hand, it means the case had not suddenly produced some dramatic fresh clue out of nowhere. On the other hand, it means one of the most potentially important pieces of evidence may have been sitting in the system for weeks while investigators worked through the challenge of interpreting it. In a case this high profile, that creates intense public pressure. People want a break, they want an arrest, they want a suspect name. But science does not move at the speed of public fear. It moves at the speed of lab work, validation, comparison, and caution. And caution matters here because a bad forensic interpretation can send a case in the wrong direction. And the sheriff also indicated that separating strands within the mixed DNA evidence could take months. That gives you a sense of the complexity involved. This was not a clean fingerprint on glass or a single obvious DNA profile pointing neatly to one person. If investigators truly had a mixed sample from inside Nancy's home, then they were trying to untangle a biological puzzle, one that might contain the key to her disappearance, or might contain nothing more than innocent overlap from ordinary life. And that uncertainty became the defining mood of this phase of the case. Then there was the glove evidence, which briefly seemed like it might become the public's first big forensic breakthrough. Earlier in the investigation, a glove found roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home drew major attention because authorities believed it resembled gloves worn by the masked person seen in the doorbell footage. It reportedly contained DNA. For a moment, that looked promising. If the glove belonged to the suspect, investigators might finally have a direct biological link to the abductor. But that lead slowly collapsed. First, authorities said the DNA from the glove did not match anything in CODIS. Then they said it did not match the DNA recovered from Nancy's house. Later, officials announced that the glove DNA had been traced to a local restaurant worker who was not part of the investigation. In other words, what looked like a strong clue turned out to be noise. That is one of the most brutal realities of real criminal investigations. Not every clue is a clue. Some are coincidences, some are contamination, some are just nearby objects that become meaningful only because fear gives them meaning. And when a case is this visible, every dead end feels heavier. Every apparent breakthrough that falls apart leaves the public more uncertain and the family more exhausted. At the same time, investigators were still dealing with the visual trail left by the masked figure at Nancy's door. Authorities had already identified the suspect's backpack as a Black Ozark Trail hiker pack, and they were reportedly working to trace where it may have been sold or purchased. They were also reviewing thousands of hours of surveillance video from across the Tucson area, going frame by frame when necessary, trying to identify vehicles, movements, patterns, or anything out of place. Investigators even visited gun shops to ask about the weapon and holster seen in the footage, reportedly because the holster had distinctive characteristics. That tells you something important about the investigation. They were not relying on a single theory or a single piece of evidence. They were building outward from everything they had: the home scene, the porch blood, the masked person, the backpack, the holster, the timing of the camera disruption, the pacemaker disconnect, the ransom notes, the tips, the border area lead, and the DNA. And yet, despite all of that work, no public arrest came. That absence created room for one of the most painful questions in the entire case. Did the person who took Nancy Guthrie know her? A forensic researcher and clinical psychologist quoted in media coverage suggested the offender may have had at least some passing relationship to Nancy, based partly on what he interpreted as the comfort level reflected in the surveillance behavior and the apparent time spent at the house. That is not a confirmed investigative finding, and it should be treated as expert analysis rather than fact. But the idea lingers because it fits one of the most troubling possibilities in the case. If the abductor knew Nancy even casually, then the crime may not have begun with random opportunity. It may have begun with access, familiarity, observation, or trust. That possibility would also help explain why no obvious motive has been publicly confirmed. A case that looks like ransom on the surface can conceal something more layered underneath: personal grievance, fixation, planning, or a motive investigators do not yet have enough evidence to name. Savannah Guthrie herself publicly expressed a fear that is almost unbearable to hear aloud, that her visibility may have made her mother a target. It was a deeply human statement, full of guilt and heartbreak, but it remains her personal fear, not a confirmed conclusion from investigators. Still, it reveals how the case was being experienced from inside the family, not just as an investigation, but as a tormenting set of possibilities, each one worse than the last. By early April, Savannah had returned to the Today Show, embraced by colleagues and supporters wearing yellow ribbons, but the return did not signal resolution. If anything, it highlighted the opposite. Life was trying to resume around a wound that had not closed. The public-facing rituals of support were there, the flowers were there, The gratitude was there. But Nancy was still missing, and that is what makes Nancy Guthrie case so haunting. In the closing of this story, we step back from the evidence and the headlines to ask the question at the center of this case now: what does justice look like when a family has spent months living between hope and grief? And the only thing more painful than the mystery is the possibility of what the answer might be. If this case has stayed with you, like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. Do you think the breakthrough will come from DNA video or from one person finally deciding to speak? What the hardest part of the Nancy Guthrie case is not just the fear of what may have happened inside that quiet Tucson home. It is the silence that followed.